Welcome to Rights for Women, a podcast all about celebrating women's voices and supporting women writers. I'm Pamela Cook, women's fiction author, writing teacher, mentor and podcaster. Before beginning today's chat, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is being recorded, along with the traditional owners of the land throughout Australia. And a quick reminder that there could be strong language and adult concepts discussed in this podcast, so please be aware of this if you have children around. Now, let's relax on the convo couch and chat to this week's guest.
Hello everyone, my name is Laura Boon and I'm one of the guest hosts for Rights for Women. Today I have the great pleasure of talking to Lynne Johnson about her debut novel, which is a crime thriller called The Bait Trap. A few words about my background and how I came to know Pamela Cook, the brains behind Rights for Women, before we start. I am part of a writing group, The Inkwell, and I'm the author of 4 books, 2 romances, and 2 non-fiction books about the publishing industry, the most recent of which is Tips from an Industry Insider, which draws on my 30 years of experience in the publishing industry to advise aspiring and emerging authors on what really goes on behind the doors of a publishing house. I'm also an editor, which is how I came to meet Lynne when she approached me to do a copy edit on The Bait Trap. At first reading, I was blown away by the insight from several of her characters into the nature of addiction, which is a strong sub-theme in her novel. I knew then that I wanted to interview her for Rights for Women. Lynne, welcome and congratulations. We're chatting on 4 December, which is the official release date for The Bait Trap, although I know the formal launch is not until next week on the 14th at Better Read Than Dead in Newtown.
Thanks so much, Laura. It's so lovely to be here. And yes, it's very exciting to be here on my publication day.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It doesn't always work out that well, the timing. But Lynne, can you please give us a short summary of The Bait Trap?
Sure. So The Bait Trap is written in the crime, suspense and thriller genre. It's set in 2021 in a fictional town called Coimbra, which is in the Riverina district. And it's set in the middle of a mouse plague. Also, bushfires have featured in the recent past too. The locals of the town are deeply divided over a coal seam gas mine, and the Judd family secrets are simmering beneath the surface. The book opens on page 1, and there's a murder, and we learn that John Judd has gone missing after failing to return from harvesting one day. Judd he's a farmer, he's a much-loved husband, father, and he's a bit of a community icon. He's not too good to be true, but almost. Then the action switches to a rehab centre in Sydney, where Detective Zach Byrne has gone, ostensibly to address his alcoholism, but really to get his wife Jenny off his back. Jenny visits him in the rehab centre. She tells him that the marriage is over. And then 2 days later, Byrne learns that his career has been put on ice as a result of a raid that went terribly wrong. He's then put on what you could describe as light duties when he's given the brief to go to Coimbra to find out what happened to John Judd. So Byrne rolls into town. He partners up with the local cop, Marco Bozic, who's a little bit too relaxed and trusting for Byrne. And the pair are determined to find out what happened to John Judd. But the locals seem determined to keep the truth from Byrne. Byrne then discovers that Judd isn't quite the clean skin that everyone thought he was. He had a hidden bush cabin that might hold all the answers if they could only find it. And there are 2 subplots in the book. What Byrne doesn't expect when he rolls into town is to meet Judd's daughter, Thea, at the local Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. She's a recovering alcoholic as well, and they fall in love there. Then Byrne's feelings for Thea and his professional obligations collide. The second subplot also deals with Byrne and his relationship with his teenage daughter, Skye, who's an influencer. And she gets herself into some hot water when she's posting for some near nude photos on the internet. And Boon wants to warn her about cyber safety, but he can't reach her because they're estranged as a result of his alcoholism.
That's an excellent summary. Thanks, Lynn. And that's really just the starting point, and everything goes from there. Do you have an extract you can read to give us a flavour of the bait trap?
I do. I might read the prologue.
Okay.
I know that prologues are a bit controversial, but I think it serves sort of, it's good material to put in a prologue because it really piques your interest. So the subheading is Coimbra, New South Wales, Australia, and it's Friday, the 26th of November, 2021 at 5:45. The outsider watched as John Judd stood at the cabin door, surveying the flint grey sky, as impervious as a tulip to his face. Judd patted his trouser pocket to check for his keys and snuffed out the light in the cabin. A languorous smoke trail crept into his nostrils. Judd's footsteps were getting louder and louder. Rising in sympathy with the footsteps was his humming. As he trudged over the scar on the landscape, Judd's steps skimmed the top of the leaf litter. There was another set of steps, lighter, like hesitant taps on the forearm of a stranger. He was so taut, so focused on Judd in the half-beat before his arrival, he thought he'd combust. Judd's profile was level with the trunk that was his cover. This secret turtleneck jumper and geeky spec-wearing phony needed to be taken out once and for all. Thwack! His baton came down heavily at the base of Judd's neck. He heard the throaty bark of a dog. "What the?" Judd said. His hands were black spidery cutouts as he reached blindly into the night. Oomph! It was like pounding meat with a mallet. Judd's legs bowed gracefully like he did at Mass, his face planted in the leaves. The outsider swung again. Another dull thud on Judd. His mobile went skidding across the parched earth. He sunk his boot into the dog's bird-like ribs. When he'd entered the forest only an hour earlier, ancient ironbark trees had sagged and groaned. Ribbed trunks had stood proud, cloaked in a sinister shawl of mist. Now evening was falling, and lumpen storm clouds were amassing overhead. The wolf call of a barking owl echoed through the night air like a warning siren, and a cacophony of bird-life shot up as if someone had fired a gun. Later he waited until he heard the feral pigs squealing, then moved aside. Their rotund bodies panic-rammed each other for the prize of fresh meat. The fading light was no impediment. Their quivering snouts guided them to their second dinner. The larger ones greedily barred the weaker ones from partaking in their fair share. Virtually all that was left were the bones. Liquid pooled on scorched ochre like a rich claret on a raw linen carpet. Tails twitching, the pigs bore witness as the remains were doused with petrol. The lighter clicked and flames danced in the night air. But would the heat be fierce enough to erase all traces of him?
Such a chilling beginning to the novel, Lynn. I get goosebumps just hearing it again. So, yes, we're going to have to find out who the mysterious outsider is and why he picked on poor John Judd. Or maybe not so poor John Judd. We'll find out. So we're going to talk about the bait trap in some detail, but first I'd like to backtrack a little bit. I'm always fascinated by authors' origin stories. Were you a reader or a writer first? And what led you to deciding to write your first book?
I've always loved stories. I was the child who spent my lunch hours in the library, who always got to school early so I could go to the library. I was obsessed as a child with books like Little Women and Little House on the Prairie. anything with little in it, basically. And then later in life, I became obsessed with Jane Austen and the Brontes and Dickens. But when I left school, I didn't think that being a writer was a thing. There was certainly no creative writing degrees, and I had this stereotypical notion that writers were people who eked out an existence in a garret. So I chose law, and I found my natural resting place as a copyright lawyer, which is the closest thing I could find to being a writer without being a writer. But I was always drawn to the storytelling aspect of law. So I'd linger far too long over witnesses' affidavits, particularly the front end of the affidavit, trying to work out what witnesses' stories were in their evidence. And I just loved interviewing the witnesses. I'd say, so the day you walked into the opponent's office, you sat down, what was in the background in his office? Okay, a row of binders. Interesting. And what was on the spine of the binders? Potential income streams. Good. Okay, so ways to gouge money out of your company. And I would just be titillated by details like that. I've always eavesdropped on conversations, and I put those conversations in the notes section of my phone. I've always been a keen observer of behaviour in conferences, in court, in cafes, on buses. I spent a bit of last week listening to the Bruce Luhrmann and Channel 10 Network hearing in the Federal Court in Sydney, which is being live streamed on YouTube. And it really is a study in human behaviour. You've got the judge asking Brittany Higgins questions, and she is desperately trying to apprise the judge of her position. And then you look at all the people in the gallery, and Bruce Luhrmann isolated in one corner and the rest of the people in a clump. And I just love observing like gatherings of people.
It's an author characteristic, I think, that we like to eavesdrop on conversations and observe people.
It is. And one of my eldest sons will say, if I'm out and about with him, he'll say, Mum, stop it. You're doing it again. I'll say, what? He'll say, you're staring at that couple. It's bordering on rude. But I just can't help it.
No, if you're a writer, that's what you do. People have to get used to us.
That's right. But as to how I became a writer, I guess in 2021, a few events coalesced. The job that I had been in for 19 years as a government copyright lawyer, that ceased to exist. All the juicy copyright litigation and advice and transactional work had been progressively drying up. We became empty nesters as our last son went off to university. We were also in the throes of a pandemic. I resigned from my job, and I thought to myself, what do I want to spend the rest of my life doing? Do I want to be doing timesheets and catering to clients and deadlines, or do I want to write a book? And I felt like the universe spoke to me. So I did a few creative writing online courses at the Australian Writers Centre, and I sat down to write The Bait Trap in June of 2021.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really quite a short period from to publications. I have to say, I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
I'm curious about what made you choose the crime genre, because obviously crime wasn't always your go-to reading material from what you've talked about. So have you become a crime reader in recent years, or are you more of just a crime writer?
I read widely across genres. I read a lot of literary fiction, crime, and contemporary women's fiction. I love crime. I love listening to confessions of psychopaths like Jeffrey Dahmer. I love listening to true crime like Gary Jubilin's I Catch Killers. I love watching police procedurals like Broadchurch. I love Outback Noir, Scandi Noir, anything noir. So I guess I found my natural resting place in crime fiction. But what struck me was that a lot of detective fiction had different iterations of the alcoholic detective, like Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon and Stephen Villani in Truth, and then there's all those cop shows in the 60s and 70s that I was glued to. But I couldn't find a story that authentically portrayed an alcoholic detective in recovery who had faced his alcoholism, swallowed huge chunks of truth, forgiveness, and been redeemed and experienced freedom as a result of that forgiveness. So I thought I'd write one. I thought I'd create an anti-alpha male detective. And so I did, in Zach Byrne.
That's fantastic. And I think you're right. The alcoholic detective is almost an overused trope in crime fiction, although it makes perfect sense to me that somebody who faced so much horror on a daily basis would need some kind of crutch, or find it very easy to come to depend on some kind of a crutch. And so let's examine that a little bit further. So what was your inspiration, perhaps your personal inspiration, for making Zach Byrne a recovering alcoholic, and for also making Thea Judd a recovering alcoholic? They're in different parts of their journeys, but I'd really like to know what inspired it and what you'd like readers to take away from that.
I think that almost everyone's life in Australia has been touched by people who drink too much. Alcohol is a major cause of illness and death in Australia. I do a lot of work now in correctional facilities, and alcoholism and other addictions are certainly a significant factor in people reoffending and returning to prison. And I guess for me, when I'm writing, character always comes first, and then character informs and shapes the plot. So I started very much with the two protagonists, Zach Byrne, the alcoholic detective, and his love interest, Thea Judd, who's the boozy lawyer. And I started with those two characters, and in a sense, their journey is a conversation with myself about what it means to be an active alcoholic and then a recovering alcoholic in Australia, and how Australians interact with alcoholics. But I thought that a book dealing with the R word, recovery, would be a hard sell. But if it screamed crime thriller, I thought that readers might give it a go. And what better place than crime fiction to explore what it means to be alcoholic? Because, as you said before, Laura, it's littered with the trope of the heavy drinking detective. And there's nothing new about using commercial fiction as a vehicle to examine societal issues. No one does this better than Jane Austen, who's my idol, and she explored family dysfunction and wealth and social class and things not being quite what they seem, and of course Pride and Prejudice, through popular fiction of her day. When you read her books, readers are very rarely ever told what clothes her characters are wearing or what furniture they're sitting on, unless she herself is making a statement about their social class or character.
Yes, and there is that amazing scene in The Bait Trap where Byrne first goes into the local pub and he's asked what he wants to drink. And there are not a lot of people in there, but when he asks for something soft, it's like that sort of classic situation where you can hear a pin drop and then everybody's got something to say about it. My dad told me you should never trust a man who doesn't drink, and all those kind of societal stereotypes we have, when in actual fact, probably, realistically, it would be better to trust someone who didn't drink and not trust someone who does drink.
That's exactly right. And it's a case of, in Australia, you're damned if you do drink and you're damned if you don't.
Yes.
Because that scene where Byrne walks into the pub and he asks for something soft to drink, that actually happened to me when I first gave up drinking. The struggles of Vern and Thea are very much influenced by my own struggles with alcoholism. And I remember in early days of sobriety, I was out with my colleagues and we were celebrating the end of a very big piece of litigation that had gone on for over 10 years. And we were at lunch and people said, "Oh, Lynne, what are you having to drink?" And I said, "I don't drink." And the place was pin drop quiet. And they said, "No, hang on a minute." All conversations ceased. They said, "Now we really need to know why you're not drinking." And I have a variety of responses to suit the situation. But I just said, "Look, there's a lot of alcoholics in my family tree. You shake the tree and a lot of them fall out, and I've just made the decision not to." And it was, I don't know how many times I've been told, "You can't trust a person who doesn't drink."
It's amazing. We wouldn't have that, or don't have that response to someone who says, "Oh, I don't drink tea." Nobody says, "Why not? Don't you like it?" Or I don't watch tennis, it's boring. That's just okay, that's a personal choice. But alcohol and attitudes to it are really wrapped up so tight, I think, particularly in Anglo-Western culture. I remember Marion Keyes telling a story about her recovery when she'd stopped drinking, and she went out with a friend, and the friend said, "Now, what are you going to have to drink?" And Marion said, "No, I don't drink anymore. It will literally kill me." And her friend said, "Yes, but surely a glass of wine would be okay," as if there's no alcohol in wine. And it's funny on the one hand, but on the other, it's really tragic because it makes it so hard for people to stop drinking if alcohol is bad for them.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. And you're right that the consumption of alcohol is so ingrained in the Australian psyche. Our diggers were given alcohol in the trenches in World War I. And as soon as our kids turn 18, they're taken to the pub because it's a rite of passage. And during the pandemic, social media was awash with people celebrating the end of the day of working from home or homeschooling with a click picture of their glass of wine. And that's okay for people who can control their drinking, but I never could. So in a sense, I feel like this book, I didn't so much create this book. It was there for me to unravel and discover, because I think it's a conversation that Australia really needs to have about alcoholism and Australians' relationship with alcoholism. And I'm just hoping it will go some way to destigmatise alcoholics in recovery and also those who choose not to drink.
One of the things I liked about The Bait Trap was that it can be stereotypical, despite having the heavy drinking detective, to also have the criminals in the story to have their actions informed by various forms of addiction or abuse. And certainly the villain of your story does have something of a tragic past, but it's not drug and alcohol related. And I thought that was interesting and a good point to make.
Yes, I did a lot of research on The Making of Murderer, and without giving away too many spoilers, what is it that leads someone to dismember a body, to cut someone up? And they're obviously psychopaths who do that, but a lot of there's the organised sort of psychopaths, and then there's the disorganised. So it's very much bifurcated. And a lot of psychopaths live amongst us. They're functioning members of our society. Often they're CEOs of companies. You're sitting next to them on the bus. They're high-functioning adults. They hold down jobs, they have driver's licenses, they command huge sums of money. But in terms of people who dismember bodies, there's always a background of trauma that have enraged them so much that they need to go the extra mile and not just kill someone, but cut them up. And that concept of going overboard is called overkill, in terms of psychopathy.
Wow.
So, I really love the researching part of the book, particularly what it is that makes a murderer.
Maybe that's a good time to talk about research. So you've talked about a lot of the research you've done into human psychology and how that impacts us. But a crime novel requires a knowledge of modern policing, and I really got a nice feel for that through the writing of The Bait Trap. Even though it's a small rural investigation, as time requires, Boon brings in a forensics expert. He brings in someone that's a technical fundi and can decipher computers that have been deleted and all sorts of things. And I wondered what it was or how you researched that, even to the point of understanding internal resources they have, like iAsk and MobiPol and so on.
Yep. I use the skills that I had as a lawyer, and I use them in the writing of this book. So in the same way that if you were, say, running a piece of litigation, you would find the subject matter experts that you needed to give the case the best possible chance of success. For example, you'll get an economist to advise your client how much they could hope to get in damages or account of profits. You would retain a barrister to present your case in the best possible light to the judge. So in the same way, I found someone to advise me on the police procedural aspects of the book. Her name, I actually found her on the Australian Writers Centre Creative Writing Graduates Facebook page. Her name's Melanie Cage, and she's a gutsy, big-hearted former sergeant, police prosecutor and crime scene officer. And when I met with her for the first time, I went with a list of questions and my manuscript, and we sat down and I asked her all the questions. And there is really no substitute for speaking to an expert in that way. There are just things you cannot glean from Googling or from desk research. For example, when I asked her, how did you get into the police force and what year was that? And she said, I entered the force in 1997 and I was lucky, and I was the last year to do a written test and a face-to-face interview, and the physical comprised of running around the Surrey Hills Police Station car park, not the grueling physical that I should imagine you would do in Goulburn. And those sort of details are what Al Alvarez calls specificity.
Yes.
And I think Kate Forsyth also discusses specificity a lot. And that goes to the author's voice. And it's the minutest details that make the reader have an intense experience. And it allows them to suspend disbelief and really believe that what they're reading is factual.
Lynne, let's talk about storytelling. I know, because we've spoken about it before, that you believe we all have a view of our lives, a narrative that we tell ourselves. And certainly this is something that drives the actions of Zach and Thea in their story. Do you think that narrative changes for someone who is an alcoholic or an addict from when they're in addiction and when they go into recovery?
I do. Certainly the narrative that and Thea have while they're in active alcoholism is, I'm a victim. They see the world very much in a black and white way. They're unable to live life on life's terms. They're unable to feel their feelings without drinking them down. And they think, if only everyone would do as I say, then the world would be a better place. But by the end of the book, I would like to think that they had undergone some transformation as characters, and they've progressed down the path of recovery, because by that stage, they are less likely to see the world in a black and white way. They are able to feel their feelings without drinking them down and using other maladaptive tools. They're able to hold on to life with an open hand and live life on life's terms. And they also accept that not only were they powerless over their alcoholism, but they're powerless over pretty much everything else in their lives. And certainly for me in recovery, accepting powerlessness was a really big thing. And I had to accept that I'm pretty much powerless over most things in my life. So the things over which I'm not powerless, then I need to concentrate on doing the best job I can with those things. And this is something that's really pertinent to writing a book, this issue of powerlessness. And it's also something that Jane Harper speaks to in her TED Talk, Creativity in Your Control. And I think it should be, every aspiring author should listen to this TED Talk. I think it's only about 8 minutes. But the substance of that is that as writers, we are powerless over pretty much everything on the journey. We're powerless over whether we'll get an agent. We're powerless over whether we'll get a publisher. We're powerless over whether the book will be published. We're powerless over whether people will buy it. We're powerless over whether people will like it or whether they won't like it. But what we're not powerless over is delivering the best possible product to the market that we can. And for me, that looks like having the technical skills, reading the craft books, doing the online courses, engaging the relevant subject matter experts that you need, like the police officer, the experts on agronomist issues, guns, farming, IT, spyware. We're not powerless over that. We can inform ourselves in that respect. We're not powerless over getting the book properly edited. We're not powerless over having an enticing cover. So for me, I concentrated on delivering the best possible work product that I could to the market, and forgotten about, not thinking about whether it will be a New York Times bestseller, whether there'll be movie rights, all those other things, because that's not helpful. We're powerless over those things.
That is such a remarkably important message. And it reminded me that we haven't actually shown, this is a sort of weird segue, but we haven't actually shown the readers what the bait trap looks like. Do you have a copy to hand? And yes, there we go. And that amazing cover, because you were talking about what we do have control over and what we don't have control over. And you certainly had control over who you chose to do the cover. And it's come out amazingly well.
I'm sorry, but people do judge a book by its cover.
I always think that's one of the most hilarious sayings, don't judge a book by its cover, because that's the first thing you do.
That cover was designed by Luke Corsby from Blue Cork, and I could not love it more. But again, I briefed him in quite a specific way. I said I wanted a bush cabin, I wanted canola, and I wanted mice, and I didn't want cute mice like they appear in Babe. I wanted nasty-looking mice. And I can honestly say he delivered on all of those aspects. So a work product, he's a very talented cover designer, but a work product is only going to be as good as the effort that's put into it.
Yes, yes. And the brief, yes, and how much you share with the designer and the insights you give them in this case.
Yes.
And again, that comes down to what is within your power and what isn't. That's, I think, a message that all writers can benefit from being reminded about, because it is such an uncertain journey. And perhaps we'll talk a little bit about your writing process. So how we've mentioned it briefly, that it's been about 2 years that you've been working on it. And let's perhaps talk about when you decided to self-publish, or why you decided to self-publish.
So I pitched to all the relevant publishers in Australia, and I also pitched to a few in the UK and a few in the US. I was not successful. I made it to the commissioning editor twice. The first time I was on the lounge in my day pajamas with the Maggie Beer salted caramel ice cream for a few days. I was not, after the second rejection, I was not on the couch in my day pajamas with the Maggie Beer ice cream. And I think, to quote you, Laura, to quote you back at yourself, I think that the factor that separates those who publish in Australia and those who do not is resilience. There's probably about 3 factors: resilience, determination, and diligence. Because it's been said by someone, it's harder for someone to get published in Australia than it is to go to the Olympics. And I would agree with that summation. And I think it's also harder to get an agent than it is to get published in Australia. I'm a really determined person. I'm a finisher. If I start something, I'll finish it. And I decided to self-publish. And someone also said it's a bit like being the CEO of your own small company. And that is true, but you have to manage all the different aspects of publishing. But there are people like yourself who you can subcontract a task out to. There are a lot of experts around. There are a lot of people in the publishing industry who will only too happy to help you or to recommend someone who's suitable. And I think self-publishing today doesn't have the negative stigma that it had years ago. You can self-publish and still end up with a very professional looking work product.
Correct. And I think that the world would be infinitely poorer without some of the self-published books that are in it today. So I'm always cheering from the sidelines for an author who's willing to take the risk and self-publish.
And I agree. And look, I think those people who are not backed by traditional publishers, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're poor writers or that they are lacking in talent. J.K. Rowling was rejected, I think, 15 times. Matthew Riley was rejected. He's self-published. He's obviously earned millions. His self-published book was picked up by an editor from Harper Collins, and she then republished it, and the rest is history. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are lacking in talent if you do not get published. Often it's just people who don't persevere that don't end up published.
I think that's really true. And it's more likely to be, or many times it can be, a case of bad timing. You may be rejected by a publishing house because they've done something similar recently. Or you may be rejected because your story is a little bit controversial and makes the publishing team uncomfortable and they're not sure how it's going to go down with the public. There's thousands of reasons why you could be rejected, and none of them mean that your book is not actually publishable. It just means that it didn't work for that particular team of people.
That's exactly right. And look, I got a knockback from one of the traditional publishers because they said, no, we've got a crime book coming out this year and next year. We don't need any more crime.
And that's a very small window, right? One crime book a year. Yeah.
Yes. And I listened to Shankari Chandran talk at the Blue Mountains Writers Festival, and I heard about her path to publication. And I think the book, her most recent book, Chai Time in Cinema Gardens, which just won the Miles Franklin, that was her 4th manuscript. And certainly the second one, which was The Barrier, she only got that published after rewriting the protagonist and making him have white skin. And look where she is now. What a great story.
It is a great story. And it's a reminder that as tough as things can be for you, there's probably somebody out there who's facing even bigger challenges and not giving up on it.
That's right. Yeah.
To talk a little bit more about the process, I know that you have a writing group. How did they help you on your journey?
I can honestly say the two best things I did on my journey was A, to do online courses, and B, to join a writing group. I joined a writing group just after I'd finished my first draft, and I circulated the first draft to my writing group. And the feedback I got from them, on many occasions, they have saved me from myself when I needed to be saved. All four of them have different strengths. Mary is a real gun on craft, and she's very good at structure, at plot holes, at point of view shifts.
Yes.
She, for example, in my prologue, I had it dark. And she said, it's 7:15. It's not dark at 7:15 in the Riverina. What are you doing? And just things like that. She also had me sending Bern back to the scene of his trauma unsupported. And she said, I don't think that's right. You really need to have a trauma specialist look at that. And it turned out that would not be a sensible course of action. Veronica is very good at character and relationships. She spotted, I don't have daughters, I have 3 sons, and she spotted things that weren't right in the relationship between Bern and his daughter. She said, she arrives in town, Lynne, and then he leaves her to her own devices for 3 days with I can't say anymore because I don't want to any spoilers. So then I had to go and rewrite that section of the manuscript to have him supervising what she was doing with herself whilst in the country town. One of the other members of our group is an editor. She's very good at casting her eagle eye over the manuscript. And the fourth one is very good at big picture. And she said to me, Lynne, you make a promise to the reader in your first book. She said, I note that all the ends are tied up very neatly in this book. So that means that readers will be expecting in your second book to have a similar neat ending. Is that the promise that you really want to make? And yeah, that is, I needed to be told all of those things. And the feedback is given in a very respectful and constructive way. And if it is, then that's exactly how feedback should be given.
It is, and it's invaluable to have a group like that who can give you an outsider's perspective on what you've done, because as writers, we get so close to what we're doing. We think we've covered all the holes and everything, and we know what we expect to be there. So sometimes we can't see it when we've actually just missed it.
No.
And then on that sort of same journey, I know that you mentioned that you shared with your writing group the copy edits that I did with you, and that everybody used that as a learning experience. And I was wondering if you could share perhaps some of the things you learned from that, or that other people learned from that.
Yes, of course. Another good thing about being in a writing group is that you get to share your knowledge. So I did share your report on the copy edit for my book with my writing group, and they learned a lot from that report. So I just honed in on 3 major things that they took away from your report. The first one was, I didn't realise, but readers imprint on the first good character in a crime novel. Now, after the prologue, the first good character that I introduced was not Bern, was not the protagonist. It was his offsider, Bozic. So what I had to do was bring the scene where Bern is in the rehab centre. As you suggested, I made that chapter 1. And then all the preceding material relating to Bozic investigating the disappearance, I relocated and wove that in to subsequent chapters, and that worked a lot. It flowed a lot better. I also had huge slabs of backstory. Like 2 chapters were just all backstory. And as you quite rightly pointed out, it slowed down the pacing of the book. So when I fragmented that
Mm.
and relocated it, and I wove it into the rest of the book. And fortunately, one of the characters in my book is the town gossip.
Yes.
And can I just say it's very useful having the device of the town gossip, because if you don't know how to get in backstory, you just have the town gossip telling another character what the backstory is.
That's great. I love that. Yes.
And the third thing was, and I wasn't aware of this, that a lot of the book was written in the passive voice. So object, verb, subject. An example of that was there was a gurgling sound instead of he heard a gurgling sound. And passive voice is not wrong, but it's strongly associated with academic writing, which is probably, why a lot of the book was written in the passive voice, because I was used to writing legal advices. But it's a lot wordier than the active voice. It slows down pacing, and it also denies personal culpability. So it doesn't allow you to make that point of view character as blameworthy or as dropped into the action. I think you rewrote a lot of the material that was in the passive voice, and it looked a whole lot better. There were lots of other observations, but I don't have time to go into them all.
That's lovely feedback to hear, and it's really nice from an editor's perspective when somebody really takes on board what you're saying. And I do know I gave you quite a few examples, but you rewrote a lot of it yourself. What's next on your writing agenda, Lynne? Can you talk about it?
Sure. So as I've touched on, legal cases are a very rich source of material for authors. The plot from The Bait Trap was derived from a British case, and the plot for my second book has been inspired by the Melissa Caddick saga that has a lot of Sydney grit, and it relates to a Ponzi scheme operator who defrauds a group of investors, a lot of whom are family and friends, and disappears after being raided by the corporate regulator. And I was inspired to write a book about, it's called Affinity Fraud. What is it that makes us want to hand over money or personal information to people who we don't know, and often people who are close to us, or people who are close to us. And that idea was spawned from a weekend away I had with my uni friends. We were celebrating 30 years post-uni, and I fessed up and said I had recently fallen prey to the WhatsApp scam, where a person impersonating my son inveigled me to hand over my credit card details. And fortunately, I acted really quickly and screamed up to the CommBank and asked them to stop the 2 transactions. That was sheer luck, and it was just also acting quickly. But then one by one, every person in the room fessed up to being preyed on by scammers. And I'm talking about highly educated, very savvy people who are not backward in rebuffing predatory people. And I got thinking, if all of you, bar one, have been preyed on by scammers, I need to write a book about this. I need to write a book about what is it that makes us hand over money and personal information to people we don't know, and how well do we know the people who are closest to us?
2 very important questions, and often the answers in both cases will make us a little uncomfortable, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
Lynne, thank you very much. It's been a great chat. Can you tell readers where they can find you in the online world?
Sure. So you can find me on my website at lynnejohnsonauthor.com, or on socials. You can find me on Instagram at Lynne_Johnson_author, and also at Facebook at Lynne Johnson-author.
Wonderful. Congratulations again on finishing and publishing your first novel. It's really thought-provoking and an insightful look into Australian culture. I'm sure it's going to be very well received and possibly a little bit controversial, which is always a good thing. I really loved the crime element of the story as well, all the red herrings you threw in, but mostly I loved the way Thea and Byrne dealt with their demons in order to get to the truth behind the crimes. The paperback is available from Amazon and from Lynne's website if anyone is looking for it, and the ebook is widely available through all regular ebook retailers. Thanks again, Lynne.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
Thanks for listening to Rights for Women. I hope you've enjoyed my chat with this week's guest. If you did, I'd love it if you could add a quick rating or review wherever you get your podcasts so others can more easily find the episodes. Don't forget to check out the backlist on the Rights for Women website, and you can also find the transcript of today's chat on the website too. You can find details on the website on how to support the podcast through Patreon, and you can connect with me through the website at rightsforwomen.com, on Instagram and Twitter at W4W Podcast, the Facebook page Rights for Women, or find me and my writing at Pamela Cook.Pamela. Thanks for listening, have a great week, and remember, every word you write, you're one word closer to typing the end.